there's no evidence of any Russian effect on the presidential election, certainly none on the Senate or House elections, which went exactly the same way, and there's no charge of Russian interference. And then the rest of the story that I just mentioned about actual interference. So it's not a serious charge. I mean, there's lots of things to condemn about Trump, but not that.
So thank you again for meeting with me. This is actually our 5th interview over the last 15 years, and I always get nervous like it's the first time. And, I was talking to some of your fans online, and they said that the first thing they wanted me to ask you is just, how are you? How's everything since you relocated to Tucson? Do you miss Boston?
Enjoying it here, doing fine.
Do you miss Boston at all?
Pardon?
Do you miss Boston at all?
Well, I lived there for 70 years and liked it. There's lots of things I liked there, but I'm happy to be here.
That's good. What do you like about living here?
The lifestyle, which is very different for us. I enjoy the teaching, very different kind of teaching than I've ever done. I've always taught at elite universities. This is a state university, teaching undergraduates, very good colleagues. The social, political environment is very exciting and interesting one. My wife, Valeria, found a fabulous place out in the desert, right at the foot of a mountain, turned it into a kind of a desert paradise, which we enjoy.
It's wonderful.
Dogs, the chicken coop.
That sounds great.
Not Cambridge.
So, getting into politics, the first thing I wanted to ask you is about Venezuela, because obviously that's the big news of the day. And, there seems to be an attempted coup underway. Whether or not that's failed, I guess, is a question, and what the U.S. is going to do now under the guise of humanitarian aid. So just what's your overall thought on the situation, on Maduro's government, and the claims of a humanitarian crisis?
Well, there's a lot of factors here. It's worth, first of all, going back a little bit into the history, not deep into the history, but Hugo Chavez came into office in 1999. There was a short period in which the U.S. was kind of testing the waters, seeing if he could be controlled. Pretty soon it was obvious he couldn't be. And in 2002, there was a military coup. We should not forget that. The military coup deposed the president, disbanded parliament, threw out the court, Supreme Court. It was openly supported by the United States. It was lauded by the press as a wonderful step. The coup was overturned in a couple of days by a popular uprising. And pretty remarkably, the people involved in the coup, even the Venezuelan media that supported the coup, were left pretty much untouched. Would that have happened here if there was a military coup? Okay. At that point, the U.S. turned to kind of subversion, sabotage, economic warfare. The political, elite elements are pretty rabid all through Latin America. The class hatred is extreme. They didn't like Chavez's policies, and they didn't like him. He openly flaunts his Afro-Indigenous background. It's not the kind of person the elite elements like. He carried out a variety of programs, could describe them, but the most important evidence about the nature of his programs is how Venezuelans felt about it. That's the important question. Well, we know there's a respected polling agency in Chile, Latino Barometro, takes regular investigations of attitudes and opinions throughout Latin America every year. Throughout the Chavez years, Venezuela ranked right at the top alongside Uruguay in support for the government and support for democracy. That there were regular elections. They were carefully monitored, declared to be free and fair. The Carter system investigated them and others. There was a sharp reduction in poverty. There was more inclusiveness in the educational system, improvements in health. The majority of the population, like all through Latin America, is quite very poor. They were given a kind of a voice and some sort of dignity. Current observers seem to think that there's still, even the Maduro government, which is pretty bad in many ways, there's still strong support for them.
I'm sorry, just how is the Maduro government bad?
Well, after Chavez died, Maduro took over. His economic policies are... Chavez had economic policies that were very poorly executed, and Maduro made them much worse. Terrible policies which really caused the economy to have serious problems. Furthermore, one of the errors that Chavez made was not to try to diversify the economy. It's a colonial economy. The U.S. took over Venezuela around a century ago when oil was found. It had been a British protectorate. The U.S. kicked the British out unceremoniously, took it over, supported it, also dictators, the usual story. But it kept the economy almost entirely reliant on oil, and Chavez didn't change that. The second mistake was the technical one, that during the period of high oil prices, he used the funds for the social programs, for international programs. He was providing cheap oil to poor countries like Haiti. He was even providing cheap oil to poor people in Boston. I don't know if you know that story.
Yeah, I do remember that, actually.
But there were no reserves set aside. And, of course, that meant that when the price dropped after his death, the country didn't have reserves to function. So it had to turn to international credit markets, which are dominated by a hostile United States. That made it difficult to proceed under the best of circumstances. And Maduro's government was had terrible economic programs, and it also, as the opposition increased, often violently, responded with considerable repression. So it became a very dangerous situation. Meanwhile, the U.S. instituted sanctions, which are so extreme that even the opposition economists criticize them. They're just strangling the country. The idea is to totally strangle the country. Well, you ask about a humanitarian crisis. It's hard to know. The press is so hostile, and has been since the very beginning, that it's very hard to determine how reliable the reports are. There are individuals going down who give a very different picture.
Max Blumenthal, I believe, just recently did the Gray
Max
Zone
Blumenthal,
project.
the most recent one is Ken Silverstein, who is a very credible reporter, has a long activist background and experience, and he just has an article, I think, maybe in the Atlantic or somewhere, which gives a much more positive picture also of popular support for even the Maduro government, despite its serious flaws. There were plenty of problems under Chavez. So, for example, there was an enormous amount of corruption. He himself didn't seem to be involved, but he didn't control it or end it. There were human rights abuses, not on the scale of the U.S. dependencies in the region, but serious enough. I was involved in protesting some of them. So it wasn't the idea that it was contrary to the claims on all sides. It was not a socialist government. The rich were left free, enriched themselves, capital was free, wage labor continued. There were reform measures but nothing like socialism.
Well, let me ask you just in the context of the 2020 presidential campaign, it seems to be a point of contention on the left. Bernie Sanders had sent out a tweet a couple weeks ago where he said, "The people of Venezuela are enduring a serious humanitarian crisis. The Maduro government must put the needs of its people first, allow humanitarian aid into the country, and refrain from violence against protesters." And there were a lot of people on the left who took issue with this, said that they were disappointed in Bernie Sanders. One of them was Roger Waters from the band Pink Floyd. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but he said, "Bernie, are you effing kidding me? If you buy the Trump, Bolton, Abrams, Rubio line, humanitarian intervention, and collude in the destruction of Venezuela, you cannot be a credible candidate for president of the USA. Or maybe you can, maybe you're the perfect stooge for the 1%. So there seems like there's a lot of this sentiment on the left where the U.S. should really completely stay out of Venezuela, and even doing something about the alleged humanitarian aid would be some form of imperialism.
There's a way to improve the humanitarian situation, the humanitarian situation. Very simple one: eliminate the sanctions. The sanctions are designed to crush the economy, starve and destroy the population, in the hope that there will be an uprising. Okay, the so-called humanitarian aid was an obvious farce. If they want to send humanitarian aid, there are ways to do it. Do it through the UN, you can do it through the Red Cross, you can do it through international agencies, but it was done in such a way as to almost guarantee that it would be blocked. It was set up so that it would be blocked, and then you could claim that they're turning down humanitarian aid. You want to send humanitarian aid, there's many international agencies that can do it. You don't have to do it in a way which is designed purposely to ensure that it'll be blocked, because it's an attack on the sovereignty of the country. So that's simply a farce.
Again, going to the 2020 presidential election, this seems to be a concern in the left, Bernie Sanders' foreign policy. There also was the fact that he has somewhat embraced the sort of neo-McCarthyist New Cold War rhetoric against Russia and their so-called election interference. Why do you think it is that Bernie Sanders might be adopting some of the talking points of the military-industrial complex, or just neoliberal/neoconservative talking points? Do you think that he actually believes that, or that he necessarily needs to adopt those positions to be a serious candidate for president?
First of all, I think that's a misleading picture. I mean, of practically all the people in the field, he's the one who's been most critical openly of U.S. foreign policy. Most of them are pretty much ignoring foreign policy issues. Sanders has picked it up even in sensitive areas. So I don't think that's, I don't like everything he says. I think some things should be different. But by and large, among the existing candidates, he's the one who's gone furthest, I think, in putting forth the kind of progressive foreign policy. Has further to go, I think. But the fact that he's repeating what you read 100% in the liberal media is not all that surprising. You know, he doesn't have intelligence agents out in the world trying to. I don't know who his foreign policy advisors are, but I don't. He's not getting the kind of picture that you and I might think is appropriate.
Well, somebody who is, I think, coming out with a stronger peace message is Tulsi Gabbard. I don't know how familiar you are with her, but she's even quoted you. She's been very vocal about how the neo-libs and neoconservatives keep pushing us into regime change wars, and we're in a new Cold War. Are you familiar at all with her campaign?
I've read some of it. I think there were some good statements, but I haven't looked in detail at her positions.
One thing that the corporate media attacked her on was a couple years ago she was skeptical about the claim of chemical weapons use by Assad. She also visited Syria and met with Assad. And I think that she may have walked back that claim recently, saying that Assad did use chemical weapons. Of course, this does seem to be a point of contention. British journalist Robert Fisk at one point had said that he had evidence that called that into question. I know last time we spoke, you said there was evidence that Assad used chemical weapons. I just maybe wanted to clarify that. What evidence do you think we should look at that supports the claim that Assad used chemical weapons?
By now, I mean, the original charges were very dubious. Robert Fisk, who's a very good reporter, didn't say they were false, but he just said they're not well established. Seymour Hersh wrote a critical article. Other people on the scene left the options open. But since then, I think evidence has been accumulating from the international observers that make it pretty clear that chemical weapons were used.
You were quoted several months ago by a Kurdish news outlet suggesting that the U.S. should stay in Syria to protect the Kurds. Is that an accurate description of your position?
I didn't quote it from a Kurdish source. It's my own view. I think that a small contingent of U.S. troops in the Kurdish areas can, not with no capacity to move beyond, barely even armed, or provide a kind of a deterrent to a very possible Turkish assault, which would extend the massive atrocities that they've been carrying out against Kurds.
So to protect them from Turkey but not Syria?
It might. They're going to have to make arrangements with Syria sooner or later. But the primary concern right now is a Turkish assault, which has already taken place, after all. It's going on inside Turkey. The Turks went into parts of Syria, Afrin, where there was atrocities committed in partially Kurdish areas. If they go on to the rest of the Kurdish areas, it could be very ugly. So I think deterring that makes sense.
Okay. Because the way that I think it was kind of spun was that you would be against the U.S. Pulling out of the civil war that's taking place in Syria. So this
has nothing to do with the civil war. This is a matter of protecting the Kurdish areas where, incidentally, interesting developments have taken place, protecting them from a possible assault by their most bitter enemy, who's been carrying out atrocities against Kurds for many years. Yes, I think that makes sense.
Okay, but as far as the U.S. being involved in the civil war, we should we be or should we not be involved in the civil war in Syria?
Well, depends what you mean by involved. So, should we have been giving arms to the opposition? It's very hard to say. Remember that the Assad regime is a brutal, murderous regime. It happens to be the legal government, but it's responsible for most of the atrocities. Now, at the very beginning, you go back to the beginning, there were peaceful protests, nonviolent protests calling for mild reforms, democratizing the very harsh authoritarian systems, some economic reforms. They were met with vicious repression. That set off the civil war. There were forces in Syria, kind of moderate democratic reformist forces, which were trying to maintain themselves, but pretty quickly were overwhelmed by the jihadi elements that were started pouring in. And that led to a very complex civil war with many sides. Should the U.S. have been involved at that point? Well, if there had been, not the U.S., but if there had been any way to protect the actual democratic forces, probably would have been worth doing, but there may not have been such a way.
It just seems, I guess, a little counterintuitive, because you've been so outspoken against the U.S. acting as a global police force, especially in concert with NATO.
I'm not opposed to the police either. If my house gets robbed, I call the police. Okay? I'm against the police when they shoot people. But these social and political world is not an axiom system where there are simple rules that you just follow rigorously. It doesn't make any sense. Life's much too complicated for that. You have to ask about the consequences of the policies you're talking about. So take, say, a contingent of U.S. troops in Rojava, the Kurdish areas. I don't want to see U.S. forces abroad. I also don't want to see Kurds massacred. Okay? You have to make a choice sometimes.
So just moving back to Tulsi Gabbard for a minute, and actually this plays into this as well, because it seems as though what's happening in Syria also is, at least in part of a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia, and something else that you don't agree with that?
I think that's very misleading. It was a war by Assad against much of the population. It turned out that the U.S. began providing aid to largely jihadi forces, including anti-tank missiles, TOW anti-tank missiles, which did stop Assad's army. It was clear what was going to happen, and it did happen. In 2015, the Russians responded to that by introducing military forces, air forces, which overwhelmed the CIA missiles and let the Assad army move on and pretty much conquer the country. Sending arms was just a way of escalating the conflict, ensuring that the Russians would step up the ante. This is their only ally. They're not going to let it go easily. It's their only base on the Mediterranean. They're going to struggle to keep it, and bringing them in more extensively was hardly, it increased the violence, terror, destruction, and so on. Again, you have to think about the consequences of your actions.
Well, I was going to bring up Russia just again because Tulsi Gabbard, she was criticized in an NBC report actually just a few hours before she officially announced that she was running for president. And it was using information from a company called New Knowledge to say that Russia is going to be supporting her campaign. I recently spoke with Matt Taibbi from Rolling Stone. He's really been a critic of the sort of media hysteria about Russia interference with the election or alleged collusion with Donald Trump. And Matt Taibbi's a big fan of yours, and especially manufacturing consent. And something he had asked me to ask you about is, what are your overall thoughts on how the media has reported on quote-unquote Russiagate, the accusation that Russia has interfered in the 2016 election and might interfere in the 2020 election?
I think it's so farcical that I barely even read the reports. It's a joke. I mean, if there was any interference by the Russians, it's essentially undetectable. There are careful analyses of what happened in the elections. You can see how it changed, how the money poured in, all sorts of things. There's no sign of any Russian effect. Furthermore, it's just almost incredible from the beginning. I mean, what happened in the Senate and the House in 2016? Did the Russians interfere in the Senate elections? It went exactly the same way. Furthermore, the whole thing is a bad joke for all sorts of reasons. For one thing, there are countries that do interfere in American elections, openly, publicly, forcefully. One of them even sent its prime minister to address a joint session of Congress to attack the initiative being taken by the sitting president. Is that interference? That was Benjamin Netanyahu, and that's only one part of it. I mean, that's large-scale, massive interference. Any other country did that, we'd have a huge scandal. Furthermore, does the U.S. interfere in elections? In Russia, for example? Yes, and proudly. In 1996, Clinton took pride in the fact that large-scale U.S. interference in the Russian election swung it to his favorite, Boris Yeltsin. The U.S. goes way beyond interfering in elections. It overthrows governments. I don't have to go through the history. So talk about Russian interference is simply a joke. Furthermore, the whole discussion is completely beside the point. There is massive interference in U.S. elections from the U.S. corporate sector, who pretty much buy the elections. There's extensive research. Tom Ferguson's is by far the best. It's very extensive, shows very convincingly that you can predict the outcome of an American election in Congress and executive with remarkable precision simply by looking at the single variable of campaign funding. And that's just the beginning. Ferguson's analysis goes right through 2016, includes Congress. This goes back a long time. Of course, it's picked up a lot under the opening of the floodgates by the reactionary Supreme Court, but it goes back to the 19th century. Is that interference in elections? And that's the bare beginning. Since the 1970s, when the neoliberal assault began, the number of lobbyists in Congress has just skyrocketed. A normal representative in Congress may spend several hours a day just talking to donors to try to get funds for the next election so he has a chance of running. Meanwhile, the lobbyists are meeting with his staff, bringing all of their huge resources, which of course overwhelm the staff, and pretty much writing the legislation. Is that interference with elections? I mean, what's being discussed is not even a joke. I mean, the election system is deeply corrupted right at its core in many ways.
Do you believe that Donald Trump colluded with the Russian government?
I haven't the slightest idea, and I don't care.
It isn't it important, though? I mean, the corporate media.
If there's going to be collusion, I think we can guess what it is. Maybe he made some deal to have a Trump hotel put up in Moscow. Okay, that's corrupt, but it's the kind of corruption that unfortunately is all over the place.
But with a quid pro quo of the Russians helping.
Of what? The quid pro quo is that he's increased military action on the Russian border. He's created a huge military expansion of the military budget aimed at Russia. He's pulled out of the INF Treaty, which is a major threat to Russia. What's the quid pro quo?
Again, it goes back to the accusation from the corporate media that Russia was, had social media trolls, that they released the emails that they possibly were working with WikiLeaks.
Yeah, but now we're back to the former question. There's no evidence of any Russian effect on the presidential election, certainly none on the Senate or House elections, which went exactly the same way, and there's no charge of Russian interference. And then the rest of the story that I just mentioned about actual interference. So it's not a serious charge. I mean, there's lots of things to condemn about Trump, but not that. Serious things, very serious things, like his commitment to destroy the environment for organized human life. That's serious, not playing games with the Russians.
So again, going back to Matt Taibbi's question, why is the media so obsessed about quote-unquote Russian meddling?
We're supposed to have the sole prerogative of interfering with other countries' elections. Other countries are not supposed to interfere with ours. Okay. Furthermore, for the Democrats, this is a way of getting revenge. Beyond that, the corporate media, though they do report the major crimes, barely, they certainly don't want to focus on them. So the media will run an article now and then about the severe crisis of global warming, but at the same time, the New York Times say will run a 1,000-page euphoric article on how opening up new areas in the Midwest and offshore for oil drilling will propel the United States into first place in oil production, displacing Saudi Arabia, and ensure energy independence, whatever that's supposed to mean, with not a single word about the effect on the general environment, actually a qualification. They'll occasionally say, in the article I'm thinking about, which is typical, yes, there will be effects in the Midwest. It may harm ranchers in the Midwest because it'll use too much water. What about destroying the prospects of ordinary human life? Okay, is that brought up? Just yesterday, ExxonMobil announced, you can read it in the business press, that they're sharply expanding their investments in fossil fuel extraction. Did you see a big front page headline in the New York Times about that? That's serious. J.P. Morgan Chase, the biggest bank, has announced that it's increasing investments in fossil fuels, including the most dangerous of them, the Canadian tar sands. You see a front page headline about that? These are take the INF Treaty. Pulling out of the INF Treaty, Reagan-Gorbachev Treaty, opens the door to the development and deployment of extremely dangerous missiles. That's why Reagan and Gorbachev enacted the treaty in the first place, to cut back extreme dangers in Russia, in Europe, which could have easily exploded into a terminal war. Okay, now that's open. It's reported, but it's much less exciting than maybe the Russians' trolls moderately interfered with the election.
And it also seems like it's being used as a form of social control as well, right? And especially in terms of social media and the voices that have a platform there. I don't know if you'd heard last fall, Facebook and Twitter, which are two different companies, worked together to take down the hundreds of pages, including the Free Thought Project, the Anti-Media, several pages that were critical of police or police accountability pages. And this recently happened with another page called In the Now. They were temporarily taken off of Facebook because Facebook said that they weren't revealing where their funding was coming from, even though that's not a rule that Facebook has. To me, it seems very scary and Orwellian now that people are so focused in having these conversations, political dialogue on these online platforms, and these private companies can just silence you because they think that you might be in league with the enemy. Isn't that quite dystopian?
I mean, there are serious things to say about Facebook and Google. One is that they are collecting huge amounts of data about everybody. Right now, as you know, this thing is pouring data into Facebook's and Google's accounts. They are using that. Their business model now is designed to sell personal and detailed personal information to the corporate sector, so that they can both direct your consumption habits, but also control you in all sorts of ways. I'd say what one of the people who's written about this, Shoshana Zuboff, calls surveillance capitalism, which is a technique of domination and control, which is sort of aiming towards what's being done in China, where there's a social credit system. You get a certain number of credits, and you're totally monitored. There's cameras all over, face recognition. Anything you do, say jaywalk or whatever, may reduce your credits, and there are penalties, or you may increase your credits by doing something they like. Ends up with a population that internalizes social controls and just obeys them. There are companies in the United States now, actually it started in Europe, but now in the United States, which have what they call microchip parties, where you convince the employees to put in a chip, and it has all sorts of advantages. You can access your credit card, you can open you don't need a key, very nice thing. Meanwhile, it allows them to monitor everything you're doing, and it's done. So Amazon, for example, carefully monitors the workers in its hideous warehouses. So it finds there's an algorithm that finds the shortest way from here to here, and if a worker goes a little bit out of the way, they get a warning and a punishment. And they found that they could increase productivity that way. UPS drivers are carefully monitored now. Fewer drivers, more productivity, by careful monitoring and control. That's the most dangerous and insidious aspect of Facebook and Google. I should say also that although it's only been reported in the business press as far as I know, Facebook was directly involved in manipulating elections in Europe. In Germany, in the last election, the neo-fascist party, AfD, had a surprising increase in votes.
I'm sorry, I've heard you say before, why are they a neo-fascist party?
Why are they a neo-fascist party?
Yes.
Because of their policies. Take a look at them. Their background is neo-Nazi. Their actual policies are harsh, brutal, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, anti-worker policies. It's a neo-fascist party.
Okay.
And a media company in the United States, a Texas-based company, which works for Trump, Marine Le Pen, Netanyahu, other far-right figures, got together with the Berlin office of Facebook, which agreed to give them detailed demographic information about the voting population in Germany. Of course, they have this massive information, so that they could micro-target ads to particular individuals, playing on their prejudices and concerns to try to get them to vote for AfD. Well, we don't have a detailed study of what happened, but in fact the AfD vote went surprisingly high. That looks like a case of authentic manipulation. There's a much more serious one in Brazil. Brazil, a really horrendous figure, the worst of all the authoritarian figures now plaguing the world, did succeed in getting elected. By one of the means was imprisoning the likely victor, Lula da Silva, who was far ahead in the polls, imprisoning him for 25 years, essentially a death sentence, solitary confinement, not allowed to get print material, not allowed to make public statements, to try to silence him before the poll is done. The next move was a massive campaign on social media, WhatsApp, which is, for most of the population, the poor population, they have phones. They don't read newspapers, don't have television. An incredible campaign of venomous lies and vilification, which is almost hard to believe when you see it, but it had an impact. People over there say, yes, people started to believe it, that the opposition, the Workers' Party, was going to force children to be homosexuals, was going to attack religion, all sorts of hideous things. And it had an effect. It was well funded. Sources were probably here, though we can't be sure. And it may be a kind of a dry run for what we may be seeing in future elections. Those are things to be concerned about.
So again, it seems like these giant companies, Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, they work together with the government, right? There's a benefit for the government to some degree, or elements of the government.
I mean, they're working mainly with the corporate sector.
It does. I mean, but like in China, for example, it does help empower the.
China's different. That's a centralized, deeply authoritarian state, and the government it controls the industry. Has a dominant control over the private system. That's not like here. Here, it's more the other way around.
I guess it goes into what you often hear from right-wing libertarians when they say that government can't really regulate corporations because of regulatory capture and because government to some degree is the one empowering these corporations to begin with. So how do people really effectively fight back under this corporatist system that we have?
Well, that's a strange argument. It's saying since government regulation only sometimes works, let's get rid of it. That's a brilliant argument. Yes, it sometimes works, sometimes there's regulatory capture. But the real problem is, look, just think about it for a minute. Almost everybody spends most of their life living in a totalitarian system. It's called having a job. When you have a job, you're under total control of the masters of the enterprise. They determine what you wear, when you go to the bathroom, what you do, The very idea of a wage contract is selling yourself into servitude. These are private governments. They're more totalitarian than governments are.
But they can't legally murder you or imprison you.
They can't legally murder you, but they can control everything that you do. Okay?
Well, again, the right-wing libertarian argument would be, well, you're free to leave at any time.
Yes, you're free to starve. That's exactly right. You have a choice between starving or selling yourself to a tyranny. Very libertarian. The right-wing libertarians, whatever they believe, are actually deep authoritarians. They're calling for subordination to private tyrannies, the worst kind of tyrannies.
Well, I know that we're running out of time. I did just want to ask you one last question. Because so many people look to you, again, I mean, people who I've interviewed, Matt Taibbi from Rolling Stone, Abby Martin, they're just Aaron Mate. There's so many journalists out there and so many people who look to you as such, a great figure who has contributed so much to dissent and seeing through propaganda. Who would you like to say that we should also look to? Is there anyone whose work you really respect, who's coming out with new and exciting, dissent, or again, kind of ending the smoke and mirrors of corporate propaganda?
Breaking through corporate propaganda?
Yes.
Well, people like Matt Taibbi, for example, doing great work. There's lots of people doing it.
So you actually read him, Matt Taibbi?
I read him, not the journal. Glenn Greenwald is doing a great job. There are many others.
Well, thank you again for your time. I appreciate it as always, and hopefully you can meet at some point in the future.
Okay.
Thanks.